Welcome to the BrettJohnson.biz podcast, where we discuss business on purpose, radically fresh leadership, capital that transforms society, and marketplace stories that embolden difference makers. Welcome to the podcast. Today we begin a new series on investing with Africa. Some months ago, one of the top bankers in Europe asked me to frame the conversation for his clients around how do you think about investing in Africa? And it's a broad topic because Africa is not a country, as you know. It's a continent with 54 countries, about 2,000 languages, a lot of diversity, and in some ways is simply just not one market. On the other hand, it is growing like crazy, and the population is exploding, and it is a young population. So a fresh batch of consumers are entering the market. And they're not just consumers, they are producers. They're shifting from takers to makers, and they are creating products and solutions that will impact the continent, solve real problems, and have an impact potentially on the world. So how do we think about investing with Africa? Well, first, let me just say that the title of a new book, which is coming out soon, is Investing Not in Africa, Not for Africa, but with Africa. I'll unpack that with some of my guests. I'm going to do something a little unusual. The first podcast is going to be AI generated. So what I did was I took my new book, which comes out July 4th, and I loaded it up into NotebookLM, a standard AI tool from Google, and it created a podcast. So you will notice that it might have trouble pronouncing some of the words, etc. But the dialogue that you're going to hear is between two fictitious people about the book, its perspectives. It has a particular angle on the diaspora who invest heavily into Africa. So in the book, I cover different zones where you can get started. Where should you start? Where should you not start, depending on what type of organization you are. I've also created a website, investingwithafrica.com. It's live, you can go there. If you are an investor, I urge you to take the investor survey. Tell me where you're investing, what sort of countries. If you live in Africa or you know Africa well and you want to profile different nations, that feeds a database that builds this notion of these four major zones in Africa. By all means, take that survey and we'll build a body of knowledge together. So I'm inviting you into a collaboration, not just to listen to a podcast series. Hopefully your thinking around investing in Africa will be stimulated. Hopefully your faith will be encouraged. Hopefully there'll be some frameworks for you to think about. Let me just say, though, that I'm not a registered investment advisor. I'm not saying I think you should invest in healthcare in Kenya, or I think that you should invest in fintech in Nigeria. So this is not a push for funds, but it's a framing of a conversation, which I hope will encourage many to seize the opportunities that do exist in Africa. And it's not just about opportunities in a market, but the trends, what's happening in Africa is going to impact the world. And it's an opportunity to participate in what God is doing in raising up a generation of faith-based entrepreneurs who are creating products and solutions that can impact their continent and their nations beyond that. So dive in. I encourage you to listen to this upcoming AI-generated podcast. And then after that, I'll have live guests. So Henry Kestner from Faith Driven Entrepreneur, Faith Driven Investor, Solving the World's Greatest Problems. He'll be on. Dr. OK Enalama will record later this week. He heads up African Capital Alliance, one of the first private equity type firms in Nigeria. He went on to become the Minister of Trade and Investments. We'll hear from other investors across the continent, members of parliament, a variety of different people. So I invite you into the beginning of this conversation. Track with us as we look at the topic of investing with Africa. And remember, you can go to investingwithafrica.com and that'll take you to how you find two versions of the book. Let me just say that there's a flyover version, which is this version over here. It's really skinny. It's for those with the concentration span of a mosquito or more importantly, we call them executives, but people who might just want to get a flyover of what's going on. And then for investment committees, people who are more detail oriented, the 250-page book is coming out July the 4th. Then there's the website, which has practical tools. I've unloaded from the book things such as case studies, reference materials, glossaries, and so forth. Those are up on the website because they are live and dynamic. So I encourage you to go there to the website. So join us. You can pick up the flyover on Amazon. You'll pick up the full book on Amazon from July the 4th. And you'll also be able to listen to this podcast series and then dive into the resources that are up on the Investing with Africa website. I am looking at doing a series, a tour around Africa with partners, looking at this topic, pulling people together in the hopes that the resources that are needed to capitalize on the opportunity that God's giving will be released in this season. So enjoy listening and let me know your feedback. As always, Brett, BRETT @inst.net, short for Institute, and look forward to hearing from you. Thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Right now, there is a hidden group of investors pouring like $104 billion into Africa every single year.
Which is just a massive number.
It really is. I mean, that is roughly double the amount of all global foreign aid combined.
Wow.
Yeah, and it goes toe-to-toe with the entire continent's foreign direct investment. But if you look at how traditional Wall Street operates, they don't even recognize this massive demographic as investors.
You completely missed them.
Exactly. So today we are tearing down the outdated blueprints of global finance, and we're doing it by looking at a fascinating new source from this year, 2026.
Right.
It's a book called Investing with Africa, Context, Considerations, Call to Action by Brett Johnson. And the mission for our deep dive today is to really radically rethink how global capital interacts with the world's youngest continent.
And it is a phenomenal text for that, honestly.
Yeah.
Because it systematically dismantles the assumptions that, Western investors, governments, and philanthropic organizations have carried for decades.
Yeah, the old way of doing things.
Exactly. Johnson points out that the global approach has historically fallen into two very distinct buckets. First, you have investing in Africa.
Right, like the extractive model.
Yes, exactly. This is your classic extractive model.
Mm.
Think of foreign companies extracting critical minerals, mining for resources, and basically pulling wealth out of the continent while leaving very little behind.
Which we've seen happen for a long time. And then the second bucket is investing for Africa,
Right.
which essentially boils down to the charitable philanthropic model. It's the NGOs, the aid organizations.
Yeah, the development projects.
Right. But the author argues that both of these frameworks, like the purely extractive and the purely charitable, are fundamentally broken when you look at the future of the global economy.
They are. Because the outcomes of those models are just entirely different. I mean, the in model is simply looking for a financial asset dividend, right? And that's usually at the expense of the local environment or the workforce.
Yeah, the locals don't benefit.
Exactly. And the for model is looking for a charitable outcome, which often inadvertently creates a cycle of dependency.
Right, they rely on the aid.
Yeah. But the core shift this book proposes is moving toward investing with Africa, collaborative capital, transformational partnership.
A completely different mindset.
It is. The with model is looking for a flourishing population dividend. It requires treating the continent not as a development project and certainly not as a quarry to be mined, but as an equal structural partner.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit, because before we can even begin to overhaul our investment strategies or talk about deploying capital, we really have to strip away the old safari stereotypes.
Oh, absolutely.
We have to look at the actual mathematical reality of the continent today. Understand the sheer mind-boggling physical and demographic scale of the place.
Yeah, I mean, the geography alone forces a complete reset of baseline assumptions, just the size of it.
It's huge.
It is. You can take the entire landmass of the United States, China, India, Japan, and a massive chunk of Europe, and you can fit all of them simultaneously inside Africa's borders.
That is just wild to think about. Treating Africa like a single monolithic market is, it's like treating the entire New York Stock Exchange as a single stock.
That's a great way to put it.
It makes absolutely zero sense. We are talking about 54 distinct countries.
54.
Right. That means 54 different regulatory environments, 54 different central banks, totally distinct cultural histories and drastically varying levels of institutional trust.
Yeah, it's incredibly complex.
But it's not just the landmass that is staggering, right? It is who is living on that land.
Right. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the demographics represent an undeniable economic engine.
The youth population.
Exactly. The average age across the entire African continent right now is around 19 years old.
19. That's crazy.
It is.
Yeah.
Especially when you compare that to Western Europe or Japan, where populations are rapidly aging out of the workforce. Plus, urbanization is happening at just a breakneck pace.
Yeah, the book had some wild projections on that.
It did. It projects that by 2034, which is just 8 years from now, Africa will house 6 massive megacities. We are talking about places like Lagos, Nigeria, which is operating essentially as an independent city-state, heading toward a population of 30 million people.
I cannot even wrap my head around the logistics of 30 million people in one metropolitan area. I mean, the sheer demand for basic infrastructure that creates is just unimaginable.
And that is exactly why this is not just some, development story. It is an inevitable consumer and market story.
Yeah, they need solutions.
Right. The challenges in a city of 30 million people, water purification, reliable grid power, mass mobility, housing, cold chain logistics for the food supply, these are massive real-world problems.
It's not just building an app.
No, exactly. This isn't about Silicon Valley funding some vanity app to help you find a slightly better cup of artisanal coffee. These are fundamental human needs that represent, frankly, multi-billion-dollar opportunities for grounded patient capital.
So if the opportunity is that massive and the demand for infrastructure is that undeniable, who is actually writing the checks right now?
That is the big question.
Because one of the most compelling arguments Johnson makes is that capital is never neutral. Capital always carries a worldview. When $1 billion enters a country, it brings an agenda with it.
It absolutely does. And it's fascinating how the author maps this out. Because whether you agree with these strategies or not, Johnson categorizes the current landscape of global capital into 3 dominant worldviews.
Right, looking at who is deploying the money and what underlying operating system they're trying to install.
Exactly.
Let's start with the Islamic finance model. According to the book, the operating premise here is Africa needs guiding. How does that actually materialize on the ground? Just reporting what the text says here.
Right. Well, according to the book, the strategy is highly integrated. It combines faith, legal frameworks, finance, and education into a unified approach to achieve what the author terms community control.
Okay.
For example, the text highlights a specific initiative in Malawi, where $60 million is being deployed strategically to build a mosque every 2 to 3 kilometers.
Wow, every 2 to 3 kilometers.
Yeah. But the mechanism behind it is what's important. The stated goal isn't just religious, it's demographic and economic, by embedding community centers that offer zero-interest financing.
Which is huge.
It is. It's a massive competitive advantage over predatory Western lending. And they aim to gradually shift local demographics. Once the local population reaches a 10% threshold, sociological data suggests they can fundamentally influence the national identity and policy.
I mean, that is a staggering level of long-term coordination.
It really is.
Then you have the Eastern or predominantly Chinese investment model. Johnson defines their operating premise as Africa is an opportunity, and their strategy focuses heavily on economy control. The numbers here are just massive. Over $180 billion in loans, and $50 billion in accumulated equity across the continent.
Yeah, this is the Belt and Road Initiative operating at absolute scale.
Yeah.
But let's look at the mechanics of how it actually works, right? They aren't just handing over cash.
They're building things.
Exactly. The strategy is building hard, physical infrastructure. Rail lines connecting inland mines to coastal ports, telecommunications networks, highways.
Really foundational stuff.
Right. And by funding, building, and often retaining operational control of this infrastructure, the goal is to lock in economic participants and dictate trade routes for the next 50 years. If you control the port and the rail line leading to it, you effectively control the underlying economy of that whole region.
It's a multi-decade strategic plan.
Very much focused on structural dependency.
And then finally, we have the Western investment model. The book describes the premise here as Africa needs fixing. This is the governance control model.
Yeah.
We're looking at roughly $42 billion in annual aid flowing through NGOs, the World Bank, the IMF, and, massive private foundations. But I really struggle with the mechanics of this one.
How so?
Well, it relies so heavily on aid conditionality. It's essentially saying, hey, we will give you the money to build a hospital, but only if your government adopts our specific Western social policies or governance values.
Yeah, the book calls it out as a highly moralistic posture. It operates under this assumption that Western institutional frameworks are just universally applicable everywhere.
But does it actually work? I mean, by tying capital to our highly specific governance values, aren't we just creating a perpetual cycle of dependency?
That's a valid concern.
If a local government relies on foreign NGOs to provide basic healthcare, they never build their own healthcare infrastructure. It feels like treating the symptoms of a disease while actively preventing the patient from developing their own immune system.
And that is precisely the author's critique. If you look at the mechanics, the Islamic and Eastern models are incredibly long-term and coordinated. They are essentially building underlying operating systems for entire societies.
Right, either through community finance or hard infrastructure.
Exactly. The Western model, conversely, is often very fragmented. It operates in short-term grant cycles and focuses heavily on symptomatic relief.
Which kind of limits its impact.
Yeah, and this raises an important question. Where does transformational, faith-driven capital actually fit into this geopolitical chessboard? Because currently it is being vastly outmaneuvered by these other comprehensive long-term worldviews.
And this is where the book introduces a massive plot twist.
Oh, this is the best part.
Yeah, because while the world is busy obsessing over these foreign governments and massive private equity firms in London or New York, the traditional financial frameworks have completely ignored what is arguably the single most powerful, motivated investor class of all.
The African diaspora. They are the hidden giant in this entire equation.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We are talking about 40 million people living in places like Houston, London, Dubai, and Paris.
A massive global community.
And this diaspora earns an estimated $667 billion annually abroad. And as we mentioned at the top of the show, they currently send $104 billion home every single year.
Yeah, and you really have to contextualize that number.
Yeah.
Because that $104 billion isn't institutional money looking for a quick exit.
Yeah.
It is resilient capital.
It's sticky.
Very sticky.
Uh.
But there are severe mechanical inefficiencies in how this money flows.
Oh, huge inefficiencies. First of all, that $104 billion only represents about 15% of what the diaspora earns.
Right.
The other 85% stays parked in Western financial systems, essentially financing Western economies. But the second problem is the friction. The leg and the stanking rails just punish these transactions.
They really do.
It costs up to 8.9% in transfer fees just to send money to Southern Africa.
Just to put that in perspective for you, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal target for remittance fees is 3%.
Okay.
So the current reality is almost 3 times higher than the globally recognized acceptable rate.
It's basically extortion. The diaspora is essentially operating as the world's most trusted decentralized development finance institution. I mean, they are the ones actually keeping the lights on, funding local businesses, and paying school fees in countless towns and cities.
Absolutely.
But they're being taxed 9% by legacy financial institutions just to move their own money to their own families.
But the mechanics of this are finally shifting, which is the good news. The diaspora is transitioning from purely peer-to-peer survival remittances to acting as formalized institutional investors.
Right, bypassing the old systems.
Exactly. Platforms are emerging to bypass those legacy fees and aggregate that capital. The book points to platforms like Borderless, which pools diaspora capital for compliant, large-scale real estate investing, and Daba Finance, which uses technology to open up African private and public capital markets directly to the diaspora. And what's crucial to understand here is that the diaspora investor is categorically distinct from a traditional Western fund manager.
Wait, I get that they have a personal connection, but distant capital is still distant capital, right? If a software engineer living in Houston is investing in a startup in Nairobi through an app, how do they avoid the exact same blind spots as a guy sitting in a Wall Street high-rise?
Well, because the risk profile and the information asymmetry are completely different. The diaspora investor has literal skin in the game. Their extended family is often in that local ecosystem.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, they possess deep intrinsic local knowledge. They understand the cultural nuances, the language, and the informal economies that a Wall Street analyst just can't see on a spreadsheet.
Right, the stuff you can't quantify easily.
Exactly. But most importantly, for a typical Western fund manager, Africa is just a portfolio allocation, the high-risk line item meant to balance a broader global portfolio.
Just numbers on a screen.
Right. For the diaspora, Africa is a birthright. That fundamentally changes their time horizon. They aren't looking for a 3-year exit strategy. They're looking to build generational wealth in their homeland.
So the diaspora has all this capital, and they're starting to deploy it through formal platforms to bypass those broken systems. How do they ensure they don't just feed the same extractive or dependent cycles we talked about earlier?
That's a great question.
Because that brings us to how investors structure their purpose. The author argues that achieving true transformation requires a specific mindset, breaking investors down into 4 distinct archetypes.
Exactly. Johnson categorizes them as planners, pilgrims, planters, and platform reformers.
Okay, walk us through those.
Sure. So planners are your foundational investors. They stick to financial basics, emphasizing faithfulness and predictability. Pilgrims are the adventurous deal makers, stepping out of their comfort zones for highly faith-driven, often one-off investments. Then planters take a longer view. They're focused on compounding growth and creating multiple income streams to sustainably fund noble causes, though they largely operate within the existing financial systems.
And then you have the platform reformers. These are the fascinating ones to me.
Yes, the disruptors.
Right. They look at the current financial systems, see the inherent structural flaws like those 8.9% remittance fees, and decide to change the underlying rules entirely.
They want to fix the system itself.
Exactly. They want to return finance to its foundational roots. And to explain what those roots are, the author introduces a theological concept that completely reframes the discussion: the theology of cosmos.
It's such a brilliant linguistic and historical dive. Johnson points out that historically, faith-based organizations and philanthropic capital have focused heavily on 2 Greek words found in biblical texts.
Okay.
Ethnos, which refers to people or people groups, and eschattos, which refers to the physical ends of the earth. So they focus on reaching specific populations in, remote areas.
Which makes sense for charity.
Right. But they have largely ignored a critical third mandate, which centers on the word cosmos.
And we usually just translate cosmos as the world. Like we think
Right.
of it as a spinning globe of dirt and water.
Right. But linguistically, cosmos actually refers to the ordered systems of society. It's the architectures of human interaction, finance, government, education, media, business.
Structures.
Exactly. The author maps these out as the 10 spheres of society. The core argument here is that true, sustainable societal transformation requires repurposing all 10 spheres. It's about reconciling these broken world systems back into alignment with foundational ethical principles.
I see the logic, but this kind of flies in the face of conventional business wisdom. I mean, every MBA program teaches you to stay in your lane.
Focus on your core competencies.
Exactly. If you build software, don't worry about agriculture.
Yeah.
But the author argues the exact opposite. He says that focusing on just one narrow niche without looking at the whole ecosystem, what he calls the city wall, practically dooms the investment.
Yeah.
So how does cross-sphere influence actually work in practice?
What's fascinating here is the interconnected mechanics of an economy.
Mm-hmm.
Think of cosmos investing like treating a human body. Western aid often acts like a bandage on a wound. It treats the immediate symptom.
Okay.
Cosmos investing acts like an immune system upgrade. It fixes the underlying biology. Let me give you a practical example.
Please do.
Imagine you invest $10 million to build a state-of-the-art agricultural processing plant. The business model's perfect. But if the local roads are impassable because you ignored the government sphere, your goods will rot before they reach the market.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
If the local education system isn't producing literate workers, you can't staff your accounting department. So cosmos investing isn't about blindly accepting a broken ecosystem as the cost of doing business. It's about actively engaging with multiple spheres simultaneously to repair the foundations.
So you have to care about the roads.
Exactly. You have to ensure the local government maintains the road, and you partner with local educators to train your workforce.
So if comprehensive system-wide investing is obviously the better approach to ensure long-term success, what is stopping traditional global capital from doing it? The author argues the biggest barrier is our fundamental calculation of risk.
Yes.
Like, we are doing the math entirely wrong.
Johnson calls it the billion-dollar blind spot. Standard Western due diligence, the kind taught on Wall Street, frequently fails in Africa because of a massive clash in underlying worldviews.
We're bringing the wrong measuring stick.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We take a rigid template that works perfectly in New York or London, we overlay it onto Nairobi or Lagos, and when the local reality doesn't perfectly match our template, we label it as high risk.
So what does this all mean for someone actually trying to deploy capital? The author breaks this friction down into two competing mindsets, the Americano mindset and the Africano mindset.
Right.
Let's look at a few examples of how they clash. The Americano investor comes in and their very first question is, how quickly can you exit?
Always looking for the exit.
Yeah. And the Africano entrepreneur is baffled and replies, I am here to stay and build permanently. This is my community. Why would I want to exit?
Right. The goals are completely misaligned from day one. And then you have the Americano investor asking, could this startup be a unicorn? Can it hit $1 billion valuation in 3 years?
Which is such a Silicon Valley thing.
It is. And the Africano builder says, we have enough real animals in Africa. We don't need fake ones. They are focused on sustainable, real-world value generation, not hyperinflated valuations based on, theoretical future market dominance.
Here's my favorite one from the book. The Americano investor says, to mitigate risk, you need an independent board of directors, strangers who can ensure objective oversight.
Which sounds good on paper.
Right. But the Africano leader says, I don't need independent strangers. I need a deep network of trusted relationships and community connections to actually navigate this market.
It's so true.
It reminds me of the analogy from the book about handing the exact same building plans to contractors in 5 different countries. The lines on the paper are the same, the engineering math is the same, but the underlying foundational soil, the local building codes, and the cultural worldview of the workers pouring the concrete that dictates whether the house survives an earthquake.
That's a perfect analogy. The Western worldview often looks at the sheer diversity of Africa, the incredible ethnic diversity, the complex cultural nuances, the varied legal histories, and views it as an inherent risk to be avoided.
Like it's a bug, not a feature.
Right. But the author argues powerfully that diversity in Africa is not a risk in itself. It is unmanaged and unrecognized diversity that creates risk. If you try to force a uniform template onto a diverse reality, the template will break.
So if the traditional Americano playbook is fundamentally broken in this context, how do you actually mitigate risk? Because, capital still needs to be protected.
Well, the book outlines several highly practical mechanical solutions. First, you implement world-class governance, but you do it by blending international reporting standards with local relational realities.
Okay, hybrid approach.
Exactly. Second, you utilize offshore treasury hedges.
Break that down for a second. How does an offshore treasury hedge actually protect an investment in, say, Zambia or Kenya?
Sure. An offshore treasury hedge basically means holding a significant portion of your capital reserves in a highly stable currency like US dollars or euros in an account outside the local country's banking system.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, by doing this, if the local African currency suddenly devalues due to political instability or inflation, your foundational capital isn't wiped out overnight. You have a stable financial anchor.
That's incredibly practical.
It is. But beyond financial engineering, the most critical mitigation tool Johnson identifies is deep, eyes wide open, local partnerships. You cannot, flying in from Chicago or London, drop capital into a market and expect it to grow without partnering with indigenous leaders who deeply understand the relational currency of that specific ecosystem.
It really is a complete paradigm shift. I mean, we've covered a massive amount of ground today. We started by throwing out the old, distorted maps and recognizing Africa's unbelievable scale and demographic engine, a continent of 19-year-olds who are literally building the megacities of tomorrow.
Yeah, and we examined the underlying agendas of global capital, looking at how the mechanics of Islamic, Eastern, and Western models compete to install their own operating systems through community, economic, or governance control.
We uncovered the staggering financial power of the African diaspora and how they are transitioning from people paying extortionate 9% fees on survival remittances to formal institutional investors using technology to build up their birthright.
We unpack the Cosmos mandate, the reality that true transformational capital doesn't just build an isolated business. It actively engages and repairs the interconnected structural spheres of society, from education to government.
And finally, we looked at how we must redefine our calculation of risk. We have to shift from an extractive, template-driven Americano mindset to a patient, enduring Africano approach that values deep roots and real-world solutions over quick exits and theoretical unicorns.
Right.
So why does all of this matter to you? Well, whether you are managing a massive family office, directing a philanthropic foundation, or you're just a curious professional trying to understand where the global economy is pivoting, understanding how capital flows and shapes societies is absolutely vital. Your capital always carries an agenda. It is never neutral. The question you have to ask yourself is, what is your capital building?
And that leads to a final, really profound thought to ponder as we wrap up.
Yeah.
We spent this entire deep dive talking about what the rest of the world brings to Africa. The money, the models, the infrastructure.
Mm.
But the author makes a highly compelling case about Africa's unique spiritual openness and its natural integration of daily work and faith. If Johnson is right about this, what if Africa's greatest export over the next 50 years isn't critical minerals or oil or even new tech innovations?
What would it be?
What if Africa's ultimate destiny is to export a radically better, faith-integrated, system-repairing model of capitalism back to the West?
Oh, wow. A model where the financial bottom line isn't the only line that matters, and where the act of doing business actually repairs the systems of the world.
Exactly.
That is a thought worth sitting with. We started today talking about maps and how the blueprints we grew up with can fundamentally distort our view of reality. If you want to understand the future of global economics, it might be time to put down the old projections, stop looking at the world through a distorted, extractive lens, and start looking at the actual terrain. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the systems around you, and we'll see you next time.